I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. Today I also pay my respects to the young Indigenous men, around 1,000 of them, who fought for the Commonwealth in the First World War. I acknowledge Commander Peter Tedman, DSM, OAM, Commanding Officer, Naval Headquarters, South Queensland. I acknowledge Di Farmer MP, the member for Bulimba, Councillor Shane Sutton, the Councillor for Morningside Ward, Mr Brian Lang, President of the Cannon Hill District and Vietnam Services RSL Sub-Branch, the Queensland Detachment of the Royal Australian Navy Band, led by Camille Martin, and all serving and former members of the armed forces who are here with us today. It's an honour to give the ANZAC Day address here in Bulimba on the centenary of ANZAC. On ANZAC Day, we stop to remember sacrifice. It's a day on which we mark the loyalty, faith, courage, skill and endurance of those who have served and those who continue to serve. And it's a day to recall the terrible lessons of war and the pressing imperative for peace and security. 100 years ago today, more than 20,000 Australians and New Zealanders went ashore at Gallipoli Peninsula. The 4 infantry battalions of the 3rd Brigade, 1st Australian Division, made the dawn landing. More than 620 Australians died on that first day of what became an 8-month battle. From our local area, 205 brave men landed at ANZAC Cove that day. 131 from South Brisbane, 17 from Bulimba, 15 from Kangaroo Point, 11 from East Brisbane, 11 from Wollongabba, 9 from Coorparoo, 7 from West End, 2 from Morningside and 1 each from Norman Park and Hawthorn. In Queensland, 57,000 young men signed up to fight in the war to end all wars. 2 out of every 3 who served died or were wounded. At the time, Australia was a country of barely 5 million people. In the First World War, nearly 400,000 Australians wore the uniform. 152,000 were wounded. 62,000 died. The men who went to Gallipoli gave themselves for the sake of others. In the 100 years since, many more locals have joined the Australian Defence Force, and in doing so they have followed the ANZAC's example. So many Australians have given their lives in our nation's defence. Their names are inscribed in local war memorials and on honour boards in every community across this country. The trees that surround us here in Bulimba were planted in their honour. Today, as we do every day, we gather as a community to honour their sacrifice. We remember those who were lost, and we think of those who returned, but were never the same because of their injuries and because of what they had endured. And as I said, in doing so, we remember how ardently we desire peace, to borrow an expression from the former Australian Governor-General, Sir Isaac Isaacs. Remembering war stokes our desire for peace because in remembering men and women's sacrifice, we necessarily remember the horror, pain and suffering of war. And war shatters families, but not only families. Every loss leaves a hole in the community, and every war injury carries consequences not just for those injured, but for the communities to which they return. Locally, we had George Harry Story, who was a clerk who lived on Bulimba Street. He was just 19 when he left for Gallipoli, where he arrived as part of the 5th Light Horse on the 16th of May 1915. 12 days later, he was in hospital with a gunshot wound to the head. Amazingly, George rejoined his unit only to be back in hospital by Christmas with frostbite. He was admitted to the hospital 3 more times before returning to Australia and being medically discharged just 3 years following his enlistment. He was awarded the 1914-15 Star, the British War Medal and the Victory Medal for his valour. He served in Gallipoli, Egypt and Palestine. He died as a result of his war service at just 34 years of age. He's buried near here in the Balmoral Cemetery. He'd enlisted just 12 days after his older brother from Bulimba, Frederick. Frederick was killed at Gallipoli on the 8th of August 1915. It's hard for us today to imagine this Bulimba family's grief in receiving the news that their son had been killed, or their worry for their younger son. When the congregation met each Sunday at the church on the street just a few up the road, people would have asked Thomas and Martha if they'd heard any news of their sons. And the community would have rallied around the Story family when they heard the news of Frederick's death. A plaque was erected on the pulpit of St John's in honour of his sacrifice. On ANZAC Day, we mourn with the Story family. We mourn with the families and the communities of all those who made the ultimate sacrifice. We mourn for the lives lost and for what could have been if not for war. And on ANZAC Day, we also give thanks for those who've returned and those who still serve. Like those veterans who are with us today, and the men and women who march today here and around the country. When Isaac Isaacs observed in 1937 our nation's ardent desire for peace, he also spoke of what's needed. Clear vision, a resolute heart, and a strong arm. That is true today, and that's why we owe everyone who has served, and everyone who continues to serve, a debt that cannot be paid. They serve so that our nation's ardent desire for peace and security has a chance of being fulfilled. So though we can't repay the debt we owe, we can gather together each year not to glorify war, but to make sure that past sacrifices are never forgotten, as we've done in our local area for many years. Since Canon David Garland had his such energetic stewardship of the first commemoration of ANZAC, we've gathered here for many years together, and as you know, the Combsley sub-branch of the RSL has led those commemorations locally for many years, and our community is very grateful to that sub-branch. And as you also know, since last year's ANZAC Day, the local RSL members and supporters are facing challenges, but our communities rallied together to ensure that this service and this morning's dawn service at Morningside went ahead. The Cannon Hill District and Vietnam Services sub-branch, along with local schools, community organisations and businesses, made sure that this, the centenary year of ANZAC, has become part of this community's continuing ANZAC story, so I thank that sub-branch as well. I express my deepest condolences to everyone present who's lost family and friends to war, armed conflict or dangerous peacekeeping missions. And I offer sympathy, as inadequate as that is, to those survivors who've been wounded, who've suffered injury, whether seen or unseen. And finally, on behalf of the constituency of Griffith, I also offer humble thanks to everyone who has served, lest we forget.